First, I'm happy to be here, and I've been understanding comics. I think I purchased it 14 years ago, maybe a little before that, and it was an amazing book on aesthetics and how to see. And I feel like it should be required reading just for any kind of basic art class, you know.
Thank you.
So and that's what I continue hearing, is that not just comic people, but all kinds of people get a lot out of it. It just kind of opens their mind up. But you touched on a lot of things that I had been thinking about already, and then I just added the other things that you mentioned to my vocabulary, and hopefully it makes me stronger as an artist. So that's exciting.
Well, thank you, Trenton. And this being a great trip for me, because I had a chance on Thursday to speak at CAM and the Contemporary Art Museum here in Houston, and I get to see this show that Trenton has up, and it's just an amazing show. You know, we have some images here of Trenton's work here in book form, but if you get a chance to get to CAM, is it open on Mondays, do you know? Not open Mondays? Okay, so check it out tomorrow. Go by the Museum District if you can, or if you're in town, stop by on Tuesday. There's something about scale. I don't. Maybe you'd agree that you know, like when something just completely fills your vision, as some of your pieces do. These huge paintings that are so complex and have so much going on in terms of you know, the way that he's using the picture plane, but he's also telling a story. He's also, you know, illustrating these amazing, strange, fantastical visions that you've had going all the way back from when you were a kid. Gotta see this stuff. Imagine, you know, images just filling this wall. That's that show at CAM. You should really see it. But thanks for the kind words on understanding. That's I love it when people are forced to read my book. So I love it. I love it when people say that it should be required reading, and I'm like, yes, force them.
Yeah.
Force them to read it.
We need a nudge sometimes.
So I was thinking maybe we could start where a lot of people in this room started. Maybe talk a little bit about how we were drawn into comics, and then maybe how that early obsession, that early interest, branched out in these two very different directions. So you towards the fine art world, and me towards, like, you know, speaking of Google or whatever. I mean, like, these are very, very different kind of career paths. But I think we both started reading like superhero comics.
Yeah, definitely. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and there was a comic explosion. So the Marvel characters were all on television at that point, and some DC characters as well. So I drew no distinction between these real life counterparts to the graphic counterparts, and I think I jumped into the comics pretty early. I remember I got my first official comic book when I was in the 4th grade, and I was getting my tonsils out, and my stepdad brought me an Iron Man and a Spectacular Spider-Man, and I think there was one or two others. I brought those so maybe Stan Lee or someone could sign them. They're actually here with me. But that was my entry point into it. But I just love the idea that you could, I guess, these heroes provided somewhat of a blueprint for you to follow and become empowered. And it was a wonderful way to grow up. And eventually I just started to make my own superheroes and paint them, draw them, paint them, write more stories, and ended up here where I am.
Yeah, that idea of empowerment, I think, is really interesting, because that's something that never completely goes away. That sense of, at the very beginning, we're just being empowered because we're kids, right? Like, who's more powerless than a kid? And so those superheroes are just so important to us at that age. And what age did you start?
I started drawing at age 3.
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to be an artist at that point. So.
Yeah. So when did you have your tonsils out? So when did you see your first comic books?
I think I was age 10. Maybe.
But you were already like a big fan from the cartoons and stuff.
I was already a huge fan, and I had the toys and everything, of course. But the comic wasn't something I had. Like coloring books I had, but
yeah,
it was like, this is something that's a bit more serious. So I felt like I had graduated to something like
But today, when you're standing in front of a canvas and you're like pulling out your acrylics, or you're doing, priming that gesso, do you think that there's still that sense of empowerment, or like that sense that we're using that power of imagination on the canvas, or putting out a piece of ourselves, almost like a kind of superpower?
For sure. And there's this idea of the paracosm, and I don't know, it's the paracosm is it's a world that you create that you can then escape into and find basically answers in that imagined world in your real life. So, Frank Baum created his own paracosm, and little children do it quite naturally. You make up imaginary friends or whatever in order for you to learn how to deal with real people. So it's like this kind of a coping mechanism to create these worlds. Most people stop doing it after they're teenagers. They're just done with that. But then some people continue, and I happen to be one of the people that continued and tried to figure out how to use that transformative power of this idea of world creating to just keep going and feel like I'm continuing to discover things.
That's fascinating. Now, I haven't heard the term paracosm, but I really like that concept. That really describes. I mean, I grokked that, from when I was a kid, and when I was, I had a room that I shared with my brother when I was a little kid, and then my brother moved into the basement and started playing music really loud. But then I had the room all to myself, and I remember I still took my desk and put it in the closet. I wanted to create this room within the room, and then a world within the room within the room. And I really liked that idea of just getting as deep as I could into that world within a world within a world, box within a box within a box. That was my paracosm, and that idea that other people escape into other worlds created for them. But I guess that's the difference, is for people in the creative arts, I'm sure some of you guys are too, you're creating your own worlds, and you're continuing to create your own worlds for you to escape into.
Right.
And that's a really powerful way, not only, like you said, not only to escape for yourself, but also to give you a way of coping with the real world, to sort of turning that focus back around to the world you live in. That's cool.
Yeah, and I feel like that concept has been it's been made more accessible, with the digital age, and the fact that these networks, these institutions are in place now, where you're kind of forced into this idea of role play and becoming something else, and having these symbols or icons represent you.
Yeah.
And I think you've spoken about that for sure. It's integrated into our life in a way that I don't think people think about it that way, but it's totally what's going down right now. We're role playing all the time. Even you go to the bank, there's these divisions in between you and maybe the action. It's interesting.
It's now more than ever.
Yeah.
And we all have our little worlds. I mean, even if it's just something as simple as a little wood shop in the basement, you're still creating your own little worlds. We keep doing that.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. I learned a new word. This is awesome. That's why I came. I came to learn this word, paracosm.
That was my one goal, is if I can teach Scott McCloud one word in my whole life.
I'm very excited today. Wow. I'm grooving on this.
I don't know, but...
So Spectacular Spider-Man, I'm sorry, I just have to say. I remember, and God bless Bill Mantlo, who wrote that strip for a while. But Spectacular Spider-Man, all I remember about that today is that it was the Spider-Man title. It was like Spider-Man title number 4. Right? There were 3 before. There was Amazing Spider-Man, and then there was Spider-Man, and there was Marvel Team Up or whatever it was that always had Spidey.
Yeah, there were a lot of titles.
And then there was Spectacular Spider-Man, and the one thing that Spectacular Spider-Man always had was it's about his friends. Except that nobody wanted to write anything about Spider-Man's friends. So it'd be it would be Spider-Man's battling the Rhino or whatever, and then he has troubles with Aunt May, And then there's these 2 pages, and suddenly every single friend he has shows up, like they all just walk together in a big crowd. They say, "Hi, Peter, how are you?" And then they talk for a little while, and then they go away because they have to fulfill the requirement to be about Spider-Man's friends. This is what I remember about Spectacular Spider-Man.
That's funny. Yeah, I like that read on it. I gravitated more towards Amazing Spider-Man.
Ah, there we go. Oh, okay.
Because I was like, this is kind of boring. I wasn't totally into just Peter Parker.
But you got into the cartoons, and for me, like I was like about 10 years before, and for me it was like, yeah, the comics were out there, but we had things like the Batman TV show, and great camp, okay, it was good camp, but we didn't really take it too seriously, and I thought I was too old for comics. You got into comics pretty early. You said about 10 was when your tonsils were out.
Yeah.
I got in when I was about 14, 15. My friend Kurt Busick, who also writes comics now, we were in middle school, and he kept trying to get me to read comics. I wouldn't go near him because I thought I was too old for them. Because I thought they were just like, junk, and I was reading real books like Lord of the Rings and everything. I didn't want to go anywhere near comics. So it was a very different experience, but then I fell in love with them, but I fell in love with the form. And I thought, okay, the form can go elsewhere. So for me, it was like the comics form, what else can we do with that? And for you, it feels as if you found other forms to express the things that comics awoke in you. So it stopped being about the form of comics exactly.
Right.
And it started, especially, I guess you were telling me on Thursday that in art school, it all began to become unleashed on the canvas. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll go back to that time and say around 10 years old. I was also introduced to the abject world of the Garbage Pail Kids. And, but,
Co-created by Art Spiegelman, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse.
That's very true. And I can pinpoint my interest at that particular time as all things graphic. So I'm looking through the encyclopedia, maybe more than I'm reading comics, and just looking at the pictures and the relation of the word or the exposition to the image. Like, I think I was internalizing that ratio and that look, and I really loved that. And I was a huge toy collector as a kid, and loved the packaging of the toys. I loved the way the plastic. I just fell in love with that kind of that material. Horror films and all mythology, and so I think that comics fit in there in some way that there wasn't a real hierarchy. It was just one of the many things and the many formats that I was interested in.
Yeah.
So I feel like my sensibilities were building toward this omnivorous to this omnivorous degree, and yet by the time I was in college and I realized, there is this space that's provided in the world that allows kind of a voice for people that have that kind of omnivorous appetite.
Yeah.
And it's the artist, and traditionally that's where the crazy people go. It's like, you're an artist, you do whatever you want to do over there. But I felt that was those having no restrictions and I can do whatever I want to do wasn't good enough. So I liked the idea of format and the structure that comics gave, and so I was able to plug in performance art. I could plug in painting or whatever I wanted into this grid or format, and have some distance and some agency within the format.
Yeah, I love the notion of being omnivorous, and the notion of no hierarchy, right? You weren't placing one art form over another. You weren't saying, all of them, anything that brought you that content was fair game, which is important too because you're in the fine art world in a big way, and a lot of people still associate, the museum culture with the notion of hierarchy, the notion that we have elevated one form over another.
Very true.
And you're helping to break that down in some ways by saying, no, let's keep our eyes open and look at all forms.
Yeah, I had this very stubborn need, I guess, to see if I could, in any way, elbow my way into the system and, yes, announce these things that, no, you don't, painting and comics and whatever, design, all of it is the same. It's just the same language. I mean, you said something the other day, it's like, everything is interesting. I think someone in the audience was like, well, yeah, what's the distinction between this and that? And you're like, well, there is none. Everything is interesting. If you, I think it was CGI to flat,
that's right, yeah.
to hand-drawn animation or something. And you're like, well, everything has its place. And, if you're able to objectively look at it as a tool, everything can be used towards a means and evolve, I guess.
Yeah, I think my whole philosophy of art, a lot of it has to do with the idea that art isn't an either-or proposition. That there isn't this moment at which something becomes art or not art. Sometimes we think you can define it by form. Like, okay, if you stretch the canvas and you pull out your acrylics, now you're making art. If you sit down to, make a toy figurine of your favorite character or whatever, now you're in not art. But it's not that simple. There's a little art in everything we do. And there's maybe a little bit of non-art, we might say, in even things that are supposed to be constructed as fine art. And I think a lot of it has to do with whether or not these things are motivated by just a sense of our desires to survive and reproduce and succeed and make money and feed ourselves. Those are the things that are sort of in the not art category, but they affect everything. And it's like that creativity, those things that we make just for the sake of making them. We do that all the time. We do that in our daily life, and I think it's helpful not to think of it as this dividing line, because then you can be omnivorous. You can see anything that I might see or hear or experience as a story or an image or whatever. Anything can go into that head and create magic somehow.
And once you get to that place, the concept of boredom, you don't understand it any longer.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like to be bored. And when we talked about that, and it's like, you just wake up in the morning and know you're going to discover something that day. It's like not an option,
Yeah, the world is not boring. That's the goal, isn't it? It's just like to get to that point where you just realize now and forevermore, the world is not a boring place.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it's also the idea, it's like to know that, wow, I'm never going to live long enough to take it all in. That's frustrating maybe a little bit, but
it is.
But it's exciting till you get to that point.
Yeah.
That you can't take any more in.
If you could live 1,000 years, would you?
I think so. Yeah.
Me too.
I think right now it's such a
a lot of people say no. Quick, how many people would live 1,000 years if you could? Oh yeah, how many people wouldn't want to take that bet? See, a fair number of people say no.
Yeah.
But the idea is 1,000, that's too much. It's like, what? Are you kidding?
Yeah.
You could barely read half of the Library of Congress. Come on.
I'm waiting for flying cars. If that happens,
I know.
50 more years, cool.
So late. Why have they not gotten around to flying cars? So do you want to tell us a little bit about that transformative moment in it was in art school really where your career, if career isn't quite the right word, but where it all kind of landed for you in the world of painting and museums and whatnot.
Well, I think there was kind of a stair step starting after high school, and I got into college and realized, I kind of really have to start thinking on my own. It's like when I was still in high school, it wasn't the most progressive. I grew up in Paris, Texas, very small town, northeast of here, and resources were limited, and the options to grow were seemingly limited. Now I know they kind of weren't, but you were told, well, here's maybe three roles you can play in this life, and good luck. Yeah. And it was only in getting out of town, and not even that far out of town, just about 40 miles, going to a larger college, that I met a group of people that just kind of blew the doors open on the limitations. It's just like, the sciences, math and all of this stuff. I had a very group of friends, and we all just talked about stuff, and that was different from where I was from. And I just kept thinking, well, what do I want to contribute to this world? Because the world was continually getting bigger, and the network. I mean, it was pre-internet, so I didn't realize really that there were like minds on all over the earth. But it was constantly getting bigger, and once that internet thing hit, I was like, oh man, this is going to be fun.
Yeah, that's where a lot of us found each other. That was the moment.
Yeah, and I was, a young, ambitious kid, and really did want to make a change. I'll admit that. And I thought, what have I not seen? I think it came down to that question: what I want to be a painter. I think I had narrowed it down that far, and was interested in navigating my way through that world. But I didn't want to do it like anyone else had done it, And so I'm looking at characters like Philip Guston, Max Ernst, people that we talked about. But then I was like, what if I bring in R. Crumb? What if I bring in, Dan Klaus and Charles Burns to this conversation? That'd be really strange, And also, it was at a time when those ideas were getting accepted in the art world. The cartoon mark was being accepted in painting as something serious and new and young, and the art world's always like a vampire. It's looking for youth.
Daniel's here somewhere. I just want to get a confirmation of this. Where did he go? Daniel? Yeah, okay. All right, give us a confirmation. Is the art world like a vampire?
Yeah, he has the bite marks to prove it. But it was a prime moment to jump in and kind of try to make a difference. But I wanted to add the idea of sequence into it, and say this character happens, and then maybe in this series of paintings, this character's doing something else, and then you follow that bouncing ball. Hadn't necessarily seen that before, and I was like, this is absurd. It's kind of dumb. I don't know if it'll work, but I gave myself like a 10-year plan, and we'll just see what happens.
You see, 10-year plan. How many of you have a 10-year plan? Work on that. Oh, you do. But yeah, that notion of like narrative, of bringing narrative into the art world, it seems like a no-brainer. Sure, there's like a lot of narrative work in the art world, but for the previous 50, 70 years or so, right up to that point where you're beginning to enter that scene, there had been kind of a pretty steady philosophy across many different parts of the art world of kind of eliminating narrative, eliminating the idea of any kind of reference to the outside world. There was a sense that anything that carried sort of figurative connotations, that was about something or like portrayed characters or figures and whatnot, was somehow less interesting. That it was very important to a lot of artists to say, this is canvas, this is line, this is color, done, right? And so you were, in a way, history was kind of ratcheting up like a slingshot for you. It was getting, like the art history was getting ready for people like you to come along and say, you know what, I do have a story to tell. I have dreams to share, and yes, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you faces and figures that are engaged in continuing stories.
Right. I feel like it was that kind of transition into, I'd say, the postmodern phase that really set up gave me the platform to jump from, because it was like, well, all of the previous eras of art were kind of flattened out, and people began to look at them objectively as this smorgasbord. You can pick and choose what you want, and then reconstruct an identity based on these previous modes of making. And so all of that was happening basically 20 years before I, thought, that I wanted to be a painter. And so all of that had that conversation had begun, and I just kind of jumped in, unaware of the conversation. Really, I was just raised on it, so it was never a question. It's just like, of course, you take whatever you want. I mean, that's what we do.
It made it more natural. You weren't doing it in a calculated way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But still, I say now there's doors that have been opened for the next generation, and I'll look like a dinosaur to them. They'll be like, oh, yeah, why are you using this story thing? There's I don't know. It just is. You just the layers seem to I don't know, keep getting lifted off or something.
Well, I promise you, as somebody who's, I think I'm about 10 years older, you will be a revered dinosaur. This is the goal, to be a revered dinosaur.
Oh, thank you.
So do you want to open up to a few questions?
Yeah.
If you guys have any.
Just say new artists 2 years have been practicing like crazy process, but just one question. Say you have yourself a very new character, very original, but you have no idea how to introduce it to others. How do you do it?
Well, we have two very different models here. I mean, I went the conventional route of creating characters and just embedding them in a very specific form, comics. Trenton has really, in a lot of ways, pioneered an entirely different way to get those characters out and to allow them to be embedded in fine arts. So I can only tell you, in my case, it had to do with like uniting story and art as best as I could. And I was lucky because I was the writer and the artist. Now, are you hoping to write for someone else to draw, or would you like to write and draw yourself?
A bit of both, really. I would love to collaborate with someone else, but I would like to work on my own work as well.
Well, if you can create something that's all yours for a start, I can tell you that right now that has a lot of currency. People are very, they're looking for people who have a singular vision, and that's more valued than it has been before. I mean, that's right now, at this point in comics history, a lot of the people who have the power to help amplify your signal, if as it were, they're most interested in people who are they're doing it all. They're just making it all themselves, and they've got a singular vision, and they're showing something that hasn't been shown before. I tell my students in my workshops, don't be one of those guys, right? You don't want people to look at your artwork and say, oh, it's one of those guys, right? you want them to look at your work and say, oh, I've never seen this before, right? Never seen anything like that. But for this very alternate route that, there aren't, not a lot of people have done what you've done. If this gentleman wanted to give it a shot in more the way that you've done it, how would you recommend he go?
Well, actually, I was going to start where you ended there with this authentic voice.
Yeah.
You have a story that only you can tell. Like, no one grew up in your skin and saw the things that you've seen. So I think it's an issue of being just true to your own just essence, and being aware of when, through your art, I don't know if you're a painter or a comic book artist or what your aspirations are. I mean, it can be varied. I think it's important to also give yourself that flexibility to, in the stories that you want to tell, in the characters that you want to create, first off, believe in them wholeheartedly. Because if you don't, then other people can sense that, and it'll keep them away from the work. So whatever you have to do to convince yourself over to this wholehearted belief, do it. And then everything else will fall into place. I mean, that's my philosophy.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. You got to believe in it. Don't do something because you think somebody else wants stuff like that, right? Because if you try to do something that you think somebody else wants to see, in a style that you think somebody else wants to see, you're going to be competing with people who love doing that for real. You cannot fake doing what they do. You will lose that competition because they are going to have more fire in their belly to do that thing. You got to do something that you truly love, even if you're not sure if anyone wants to see it.
I see. So basically, don't be a people pleaser. Just
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the way I usually sum it up is just because you've decided to sell out doesn't mean that anyone's going to buy. you might as well care. You know, at least you're starting with an audience of 1 instead of 0.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Oh, I see one back there.
Yeah, so people are going to be a little more focused on the main characters, which is great and all. But how do you bring a little more glory to your more minor characters so that they are not just completely flat?
That's a good question, and one I've never heard before. Maybe you have, but I would say for my own work, I try to remember that every character believes that they're the star of the story. That's like number one. Every single character in your story, even if they only have one line, even if they're like the coat check guy who says, "Yes, sir," okay? He really thinks it's about a coat check guy. He thinks that whole story is about him. Every one of them have to have an inner life. Kurt Vonnegut said, every character should want something, even if it's only a glass of water. If you understand what those characters want, then their story, it writes themselves. Everyone should carry their own story on their back like a turtle, you know? And that's the important thing, knowing what they want. Again, even if it's a small thing. And then the other thing is to make sure that every character has enough of an inner organizing principle that they manifest that in the way they look and the way they act. Not only should they want different things, but they should have a different look to them. And it's not just about like learning to draw one type of man and one type of woman and then putting different beards and glasses and hair on them. Think the whole figure, the whole character, all the costume details should add up to a single impression. Wendy Peeney and others did that. Will Eisner did this by using animals as sort of an interior organizing principle. So you'd have a person who looks like a person, but deep down inside, everything has been designed around like a fish, like a wide-mouthed bass or a particular bird, that sort of thing. That's a really good shortcut, if you like. But desire, that's what it's all about for me. How about you, Trent?
I think always being aware of the whole. There's the main character, supporting characters are just, even the main character is a supporting character to the larger picture. So you have to figure out what the hierarchy is, and as Scott said, everything adds up to this unified whole. But what the ratios are underneath that, it's like a pie chart. What the ratios are, you're in control of that. How much of the supporting character are we supposed to see? Like, it goes back to the tenets of design. Like, what do you need to tell the story? And just constantly think about that. And one thing starts overpowering another, and it starts to encroach on the integrity of that big picture, then you know there's an issue. So I think that, to me, that's it. And you can apply that to any craft. I apply it to painting all the time. When one area of the painting starts to overtake the rest, I take a knife to it and cut that offending area out and put something else there that's a little less loud, and then I keep going from there. But it's a constant checks and measures system, I think.
Yeah. We can't take a knife in our when I'm making the comments. Actually, we kind of do take a knife. Any other questions? How are we doing?
I know that you have created a superhero, a torpedo boy, who I see there on the left.
Oh yeah, let's take a look at these guys.
The character on the right is a
Torpedo boy.
and these characters that you've created, you've had them, from inception.
It's the evil
now
vegan.
some over 10 years. You've been creating with them, and so I was wondering along that process how how the characters have grown to you. Do you have moments where you're like, oh, they've got, they're tired, they don't have anything to say,
Sure.
or then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, he wants to have this adventure. Like,
Well,
how have you
well,
been with that?
So, as I was saying about, thank you for the question, and as I was saying about the previous question, I'm thinking about this whole picture, and at some point I realized, well, the span of my life is the big picture. So this idea of art and life, I've made the choice to erode those boundaries. So sometimes I'll live a portion of life and look back and say, okay, that's a piece, really. And then how the art plugs into that bigger picture is it's this give and take between me living the life and then giving back to the studio and the studio. So it's this symbiotic sort of back and forth thing. He's always doing that.
He's always leaning.
Rambunctious. But I invented Torpedo Boy when I was in the 5th grade. And so that character's been with me for a very long time. And at some point, and at first he was an archetypal superhero. He always showed up on time, saved the day, and left with a smile, and there was hope. And then when I got older and I started to develop my more Tolkien-esque system of grunts and evil and, it's like good almost didn't exist anymore, and maybe it was my worldview changed or something, but it was just these varying degrees of decrepitude and and then some characters were maybe oblivious to that's the way things are, but maybe when people look in, they associate that oblivious or ignorance with happiness and good or something. So my whole project is this critique on the values and ethics that we have grown to, I guess, accept as truths, and I'm trying to challenge those truths. So the characters change as my idea of those truths change, and I just want to. It's like this moving target, and I always want people or the audience to enter the work with where they are in that journey and what their understanding is of truth. And therefore, these characters will look different to everybody out there, and they'll see a different thing. And I want that. That's what keeps me going, and keeps things changing, and it doesn't get stagnant.
Yeah.
So that's a convoluted answer to your question.
And again, I very highly recommend either today, tomorrow, or Tuesday, because it's closed on Monday. Definitely swing by the Contemporary Arts Museum, where you see these massive displays of these characters in all different forms. And there's, one of the things that you're also doing is you're taking these individual moments or states, and you're also still very much aware of the picture plane, very much aware of them as lines, marks on paper, and creating these just unforgettable, like immersive canvases of these characters as well in these situations. But what you're talking about is a lot like what Alan Moore is doing, what Chris Ware is doing, where they have that sort of that childhood imagination and things from our childhood that have survived intact into this more complex adult world, and are, they're still floating around in this soup, and they still retain some of that childlike quality, but they're also entering into a much more complex, kind of existentially fraught world. I think there's something even more poignant when you still can see, you can still recognize in these characters, for example, this came from your childhood, and you've decided not to just scrub it. You're not rewriting your own aesthetic history. You're embracing it and saying, this is part of where I came from.
Right. And using it as a pool or a resource to draw from. And so time doesn't mean the same in my studio maybe it is to other artists, because I see this continuum. And so I'm constantly going back and making prequels, really. Like I'll write a story and then I'll go back and say, well, what happened between 1820 and 1937, and I'll flesh out that bit. And then I'll go 50,000 years ago and then say, okay, this is where that character's ancestors came from. And then the spirit energies came down and imbued them with these powers. Oh, and that must have affected something on the timeline way up here. And so I'm always jumping back and forth, and it's crazy person stuff. But it's
it's a little crazy.
It's really fun.
Were you influenced at all by, speaking of crazy persons, were you influenced at all by people like Henry Darger?
Yeah, he entered into my consciousness through Raw magazine.
Oh,
so
yeah,
that
yeah.
thing changed my life. Art Spiegelman.
Darger, we should say, was he was, I think, a janitor in a school in Chicago. Lived
yeah.
to his 80s or 90s, and when he died, nobody, like the folks in his apartment building went up and discovered that he had done about 100,000 pages of this fantasy world that he had created with all these characters, and he had weather maps, he had like timelines and everything.
Totally.
And it's like where you're sort of like unleashing enough of the crazy to make it happen aesthetically without like becoming like Darger,
Right.
who obviously fell down the rabbit hole.
Well, I have friends and family that love me a lot, and they keep pulling me back. So yes.
It's good. Yay for family. Any other questions? Yes.
So how do you think the internet and the graphics moving away from physical art to more digital art are going to affect? Do you think there'll be a profound effect in the message at all, or this is just another medium?
That's a better one for you.
Yeah. Let's see what time it is. Yeah,
We have
I
15
could
minutes.
go for a while on that subject, but just basically, very briefly, as far as the art form of comics go, I think it's a very exciting time, both in terms of distribution and in terms of like the creative opportunities. But one of the cool things that relates to what we're talking about here is the fact that what happened was when I started out, paper and ink, which was our primary form of getting our stories out in the comics form, that was just the default setting, right? Nobody went in 1975. Nobody said, "I'm going to make comics and I'm going to make them on paper with ink." Nobody said that because, well, of course, everybody does that, right? And so paper was invisible. It was only when we started to see things like when the web started to take off in the 90s, that people suddenly had this alternative way of getting their work out there, and paper became visible. And one of the things that sort of connects up with what we're talking about here is the fact that there's also an art comics movement that's become really aware of comics as things, as these objects that you can hold in your hands. And these are folks who are doing beautiful silk screen stuff, who are creating art objects, who are, doing these things, like tied with twine, printed on denim with silkscreen day-glow pictures of Godzilla on them or whatever, and editions of 87. And, what they're saying is, the thing matters. And one of the reasons they're doing that is because there's this other side of the ledger, and guys like me and others who are really interested in what's going on in the web where the thing no longer matters. Trent is working in an area where the thing matters, where the actual physical work matters. One of the reasons I keep pimping the show at CAM is because it's amazing to be there in the presence of the thing. These massive paintings, these rows of narrative panels, all of these things exist as objects as well as stories, as well as imagery and content. And it's just a really powerful thing. So what the gift of this non-tangible form of the internet, one of the gifts, was it also made us able to finally see what we were holding in our hands for what it was, instead of just the only way to do it, And that was really exciting. So it's an exciting times both ways. I'm super excited about what's going on in the intangible world. I've written whole hundreds of pages just on that. But it's really cool also to see people finally aware of the physicality of this stuff. Sorry.
That was so late.
Did I do is that bad? Is that the bad version? She's heard 20 times she's heard me give that answer. Yes?
I have a follow-up to that question. If you had to start your career over today, just getting ready to you've got a character ready to put it out, would you go through more of the mainstream publication models, or would you try going online and making your own website and doing all that kind of stuff?
I'd probably go online, but I'd be 17 when I did it, right? I'd be earlier. I'd be out there earlier. And that's one of the things that's happening now is I was 24 when I got my first comic published. That was considered kind of young. But if I'd had a chance to get my work out there when I was 17, I would have gotten out there when I was 17, and that's what people do, is they get it out very, very young. And then it's just assumed like, oh, your first comics are going to suck. But that's okay, you know, that's in the archive. Go look at the first Penny Arcade. Ugh. You know, you know, but you get better. You grow in public. That's new.
That guy.
I want to say that in the reinventing comics, the whole concept of intermingling the comic book with the art is actually in fruition today, and this concept that we have going on. And I wanted to say, what do you think it's going to lead us into the future in regards to that intermingling of the art world and the comic world, you know, leaving the place, you know, where it was, where it's just, you know, funny books, into actual meaningful and progressive and important and something that is, you know, touching not only, you know, eyes but hearts, minds, and souls.
Well, we're definitely, I mean, people seem more omnivorous, just like you were saying.
Right.
Don't you think?
I think, you know, when one art form starts to show signs of dying, that's where the art world steps in.
Yeah. Oh, it's
And-
so true.
Yeah, and they attempt to document and archive, and then of course commodify those objects, and that's definitely what's happening with comics as the digital age happened and it's more going paperless. It's like, well, we better scavenge all of the paper. So I remember Masters of American Comics happened,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden the art world saw the objects. They were like, oh, these crumb pages are beautiful. Look at the drawings on the edges, and like it was more about that. But if you look at Hollywood, what's happening, I think comics are really, you know, I had my mind's still blown. I was at the Stan Lee panel last night, and just to hear his voice in person was so amazing. And he kept reiterating this idea that he's so glad he's lived long enough to see this revolution in cinema happen, where comics are taken so seriously. So I think it's happening in all the realms where it's just branching out.
Yeah, I mean, like, okay, we've got the snooty expert, and we've got the man being exhibited at the Contemporary Arts Museum, and you can bet we both went and saw X-Men, or you're about to, I think. Or you?
Yeah, we're about to.
You're about to see it, right? Yeah. Well, like, but that's the thing. I mean, like, look at that, right? We're exactly the sort of people who think we'd be sniffing our noses at that stuff. They're good movies, though. They're good movies, and that genre anxiety is starting to disappear. People like Henry Jenkins have written about this sense that we're past that period where people are really anxious about origins, about the sense that, oh, well, is this somehow a tainted genre? Is this something that I'm above or whatever? It's like, no, it's all fun. It's like we're all just throwing stuff in our heads.
It's all fun, but I think I'm convinced that people want to look to something bigger than them. They want to look at this, like, back in the day it was Zeus and the gods, and you know, the people look to the Bible. They look to these stories that give them some sort of a guideline to go by. And you know, the comic book, I mean, Marvel, DC, those worlds go so deep that it's you know, it's somehow beyond biblical. It's like where these characters were born, who they married, when they died, you know, if they were reincarnated. Like, it's just all of this crazy tributaries that is endless.
Well,
and
dude, the Bible's only 2,000 pages.
Is it?
That's like, God, like Fantastic Four ran longer than that.
Totally.
Yeah, it's a pretty deep canon, you know, like to go into, yeah. But yeah, that notion of modern mythology, I mean, people, that's actually been, you know, that's been out there as a concept for a while now, that the idea that this is our modern mythology. But I think, I don't know if you're as surprised as I am to see it be as mainstream as it is here in 2014. I never dreamed back in the 70s that these characters I was reading would be, like, everybody knows, you know, like, oh, I can't say that because it's a spoiler, but okay, but things like, we saw X-Men yesterday, and certain things in that movie, I realized everybody watching that movie is going to, oh yeah, that's because of this happened in that previous timeline. It's like, what are they all, Mark Gruenwald or something? We're like from like reading the captions.